There's plenty of evidence that questioning the government in Russia is more dangerous than it's been in living memory. My guest this week was sentenced to 25 years in jail for criticizing the war in Ukraine, but was released this year in the largest East-West prisoner swap since the Cold War. He's Vladimir Kara-Murza, and he's lost none of his idealism or optimism about the future. Despite all evidence to the contrary, this British-Russian national insists that one day Russia will become a modern, free European country.
And the future does not belong to archaic, belligerent, repressive, one-man authoritarian dictatorships like the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin. The future belongs to democracy, and there's absolutely no reason why the Russian people should not be able to live in a developed democratic system just like the rest of European countries.
Where on earth does that certainty come from? Vladimir Kara-Murza, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to spend a good deal of this interview talking about your personal experiences and what you learned from them about your country and indeed about yourself. But we're talking in what's been widely described as a period of maximum danger in East-West relations. How do you think the West is handling it, and has it been guilty of appeasing Russia, do you think?
Well, I think if we look at the last 25 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, because next month will mark exactly 25 years since this man came to power in Russia, we will see a sad history of appeasement of Vladimir Putin by Western leaders on both sides of the Atlantic, because the direction of Mr. Putin's rule was very clear from the very beginning. As we remember well, one of the first acts of Vladimir Putin in office was to reinstate the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. Now, Russia is a country of symbols, and if you were to choose a symbol to signal the direction of your rule, you could not have chosen a more potent one. And it wasn't long before the symbols were followed by actions. And Vladimir Putin's regime began to move against independent media, against political opponents, against the independence of the judiciary, of parliament, the institution of elections, and so on, and very quickly transformed Russia from the imperfect democracy we had back under Boris Yeltsin in the 1990s to the perfect dictatorship that it is today. But all this while, we saw Western leaders on both sides of the Atlantic shake Vladimir Putin's hand, invite him for international summits, roll out a red carpet, buy oil and gas from him, look into his eyes and see his soul, push reset buttons, and so on and so forth.
If you're right about... I'm sorry to interrupt.
We know from history what the appeasement of dictators leads to. We know this from the history of the 1930s, and we know this also from the history of the last 25 years of Vladimir Putin.
If you're right about appeasement, does the West look like an easy target as far as Putin is concerned, especially where Ukraine is concerned?
It has to be remembered that, in a democratic system, compromise is a good notion, right? Because, democratic politics is based on compromise, on checks and balances, on finding common ground. But for a dictator, for an aggressor, for a bully like Vladimir Putin, compromise from the other side is not an invitation to reciprocate. It's an invitation to grab more, to be more aggressive, to attack someone else. And this is exactly what Vladimir Putin's been doing, because you know what? He got away with attacking Georgia. He got away with annexing Crimea. He got away with testing several dozens of Russian armaments on the civilian population in Syria in 2015. And in February 2022, he thought, okay, if I'd gotten away with all of that before, I'm going to get away with this one too. And I think he was actually surprised by the united front that the West finally put up in support of the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. As they say, better late than never. But it's really important that the Western governments do not fall back into the habit of appeasing Vladimir Putin, because we do hear such voices in recent times coming from Western capitals.
How far beyond Ukraine do you imagine that Putin's ambitions extend?
Look, Vladimir Putin's sole goal is to continue staying in power through whatever means necessary. He has been in power for a quarter of a century. He does not have any intention of leaving. It doesn't mean he won't leave.
But expansion of his borders, expansion of his borders.
Well, in Russia, we know from the modern history of Russia that internal repression and external aggression always go hand in hand. And after Vladimir Putin was done with destroying the opposition in Russia, and I mean including destroying physically, the two leading political opponents of Vladimir Putin, Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, were murdered on his direct orders. After he was done with suppressing, any alternative viewpoints, any opposition inside the country, he moved outside his borders. And so as long as this man remains in power, as long as this aggressive authoritarian regime remains in the Kremlin, Russia will continue to be a threat both to its own people, to our own citizens, and to neighboring countries. The only strategic solution to this is to have this regime in the Kremlin replaced by a legitimately elected democratic government that will respect the rights and freedoms of our own people and will respect the international rules of civilized behavior on the world stage. This is the only way to ensure lasting peace, stability, and security on the European continent, a democratic Russia.
I want to talk about that and a possible pathway to that later on. But I wonder if, in your view, Putin is in fact winning the war at the moment. I ask because here's a man indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court, and yet the heads of some 25 countries, representing more than 40% of the world's population, were quite happy to turn up recently in Sochi for the so-called BRICS summit to smile and shake his hand. Are you disappointed by that and by the complete lack of condemnation from those leaders for what he's been doing in Ukraine?
Well, frankly, it was shameful to see those photographs from Kazan and, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, shaking Vladimir Putin's hand and literally bowing to him. I mean, at least that's what the photo looked like. You remember the one I'm talking about. And also recently, in the last 3 months or so, Vladimir Putin made an official visit to Mongolia, which is actually a signatory state to the Rome Statute and is legally obligated to follow through with the ICC warrant, but it didn't. It rolled out a red carpet for Vladimir Putin, and it invited him in. The president of Mongolia shook his hand before the cameras and so forth. By the way, I think there should be international consequences for Mongolia in this, because if a country flagrantly violates its clear legal obligations, as it did in this regard, there have to be some consequences for that. This is not acceptable.
When it comes to Western sanctions on Russia, you're not happy, are you? Because Putin is still finding a way around many of them, but also because some are affecting ordinary Russians rather than the regime. Why is that so bad? Aren't Russians likely to oppose the war if they're affected in a non-aggressive, non-military manner?
Look, in these last 4 months that I've been out of prison, I've been sort of catching up on 2.5 years worth of information vacuum, and I've been frankly shocked by the way the sanctions mechanisms operate in many Western countries. On the one hand, I was shocked by how many glaring holes there still are in the sanctions mechanism. For example, it was an absolutely astonishing fact that I read in a recent report in a London think tank that up to 30% of all the armaments and all the military technologies used by Putin's army in Ukraine still come from Western or Western allied sources. This is unacceptable. We're almost 3 years into this full-scale invasion, the largest military conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. And we still see that, well, in essentially Western countries are aiding and abetting Putin's war effort in Ukraine. This is the only way I can put this. I was shocked to see that so many people from Putin's close circle are still freely able to travel around Western countries and are still enjoying, the benefits and privileges of traveling around countries in the European Union, for example. Again, this is completely unacceptable almost 3 years into the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And of course, we are seeing many other ways that the Putin regime has been able to circumvent these international sanctions, particularly with the so-called shadow fleet, which he's using to continue selling his energy resources all over the world.
But what about your objection to the sanctions on people, that hit Russian people?
I was just coming to that. On the other side of the issue, I see that some countries, not all I have to stress is this, but some countries in the European Union have chosen to impose these complete blanket bans on everybody who happens to have a Russian passport. People are banned from coming in, from crossing the borders, from receiving visas, from driving with Russian number plates, and so on. And first of all, this is completely unacceptable in the 21st century to discriminate against an entire nation simply based on citizenship, based on nationality. In fact, this is expressly prohibited by Article 14 of the European Convention on Human Rights. But this also plays directly into the hands of Putin's propaganda machine, because it makes it so easy for the Kremlin to say, oh, look, these Westerners, they're all Russophobes, as the Kremlin propagandists like to say. They hate everybody who's Russian. And this is just an easy way that Putin's propaganda can have a field day with this. And to me, the sanctions mechanisms have to be recalibrated in a way where they actually hit what needs to be hit. They actually target the Putin war machine. They actually target the Putin war economy and make it more difficult and ideally impossible for Putin's regime to continue this war of aggression in Ukraine. But on the other hand, it is unacceptable when sanctions in a blanket way target anybody who happens to have a Russian passport.
The Ukrainians weren't so happy with what you said. One of them, presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, said certain people calling themselves Russian opposition call for easing sanctions, probably to ensure war resources don't run out. The true Russian opposition, actively with weapons in hand, helps repel Putin's hordes in Donbass and Kharkiv regions. He was referring to Russian volunteer units fighting on Ukraine's side. Has he got a point?
Well, in fact, what you just quoted directly contradicts what I've just said to you. Nobody's calling for easing sanctions. We are calling for recalibrating sanctions to make sure, let me repeat this again, that sanctions actually do target Putin's war machine and Putin's war economy and make it more difficult or at best impossible for him to continue his war of aggression in Ukraine. But yes, on the other hand, these sanctions should not hit independent journalists from Russia, human rights activists from Russia, independent lawyers from Russia, who are actually very often helping Ukrainian POWs in Russian prisons, because it absolutely makes no sense that these people should be targeted solely because they hold a Russian passport. This is what we're saying. If some people choose to sort of pervert and twist around what we are saying, let that remain on their conscience.
You've said that Putin must not be allowed to win. What if he does?
Well, of course, in the most important sense, Putin has already lost the war in Ukraine.
Some say he's already won.
No, he has already lost, because let's not forget his original aims in February 2022. He was taking Kiev in 5 days. He was destroying Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country that is able to make its own decisions in foreign and domestic policy. And on both of those counts, very clearly, Vladimir Putin has utterly failed.
But he holds 20% of the country. He holds 20% of the country now.
The goal was 100%. The goal was the destruction of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent state. Of course, what you're saying, that's exactly how the Putin propaganda machine will try to present it. But he must not be allowed to get away with this, because the only way to judge the outcome is to compare it with the original goals. He didn't take Kiev in 5 days. He did not destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country, and it's very clear that he will not be able to, because of the, very strong, very resilient resistance by the Ukrainian people over these last almost 3 years, really. Well, over these last 10 years, really, because let's not forget that actually Putin began his war in Ukraine in the spring of 2014. And whichever way the Putin propaganda machine will try to twist this, in the most important sense, he has already failed. But I agree with your point that whatever the final settlement looks like, there's a lot of talk that the new American administration will move to towards achieving some sort of a settlement in next year in 2025.
Freezing the conflict on current lines. That's been the proposal,
yes.
hasn't it?
None of us knows how exactly this will look, but there's a lot of talk on that in the media. And it's very, very important that the Putin regime is not allowed to present itself as coming out triumphant from this war, because we know that this would only encourage an aggressor to strike again.
Let's talk, if we may, about you personally. Sentenced last year to an almost unbelievable 25-year jail term on treason charges, in particular criticizing the war in Ukraine. You said at the time that after 2 decades in Russian politics, with all you'd seen and experienced, nothing could surprise you. But this did, didn't it? This 25-year sentence really surprised you. Why, when you'd seen the brutality of the regime close up?
Well, I'm a historian by education, and when I was arrested back in the spring of 2022 after the full-scale war began, I was expecting my experience to be somewhat similar to the experience of the dissidents of the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s in the Soviet Union. But actually, the experience that I went through was much closer to Stalin's times, in the sense that my trial was held completely behind closed doors, in the sense that the defense was not even formally allowed to, to present evidence, to add any documents. And this was a complete sham, even by the standards of, the post-Stalin period, let's say under Leonid Brezhnev in the Soviet Union. And of course, as you've mentioned, Tim, the sentence itself, and the last time political prisoners in our country got 25-year sentences were under Joseph Stalin. A sentence this long has not been handed down to a political prisoner since Stalin's death in 1953. And this was, of course, a message from the Kremlin regime. It wasn't only for my public criticism of the war in Ukraine. It wasn't only for my public criticism of the political repression and political assassinations in Russia. It wasn't only for my public criticism for the illegality of Putin subverting the constitutional term limits to stay in power essentially forever. Those were the official charges in my case. But the added sort of unofficial charge was my involvement over many years in advocacy for the Magnitsky laws around the world, laws that impose targeted personal sanctions on human rights abusers from Putin's close circle. It was because of my involvement in the Magnitsky laws that I've been twice poisoned by an FSB death squad in 2015 and 2017. And the judge who handed me my 25-year sentence last year was the same judge, Sergei Prigorov, who had jailed Sergei Magnitsky back in 2008, and who was one of the first people sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act in the United States that I helped pass. And so this was very clear, very demonstrative from the Kremlin. And it shows, by the way, what they're really afraid of. They really are afraid of Western countries imposing these targeted personal sanctions on people who've long got used to stealing in Russia and then stashing away and spending that money in the West. And those types of sanctions should absolutely be strengthened, expanded, and made more effective.
You were kept in solitary confinement day after day. What were the worst moments for you?
Well, look, it's like an endless Groundhog Day. You know, it's meaningless. Every day is the same. I was sitting in a small cell, a cupboard-like cell, 2 by 3 meters, 4 walls, a small window under the ceiling with metal bars. Your bunk bed gets attached to the wall at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then you can't take it down again until the lights out at 9 p.m. So the whole day, essentially, you can just walk around in this small circle inside the cell or sit at this really uncomfortable stool that sticks out of the wall. Can't really sit on that for long. You have no one to speak to. You have nothing to do. You have nowhere to go. They only allow you to write, so they only give you a pen and paper to write for 90 minutes a day. That's all, and they take it away again. And
where do you
worst of
go?
all,
Where do you go in
and-
your mind under those conditions?
well, and worst of all, they did not allow me to communicate with my family. I was not allowed any phone calls with my wife or my children. And this is the tradition that goes back to Stalin's time as well, where they seek to punish not just the political opponent, but the family too. And so what really helped survive in that situation, and what really helped to stay sane, I'll be honest with you, is, first of all, my Christian faith. Because, you know, I know that at the end of the day, everything will be decided up there, not by some people who think that they rule everything. Secondly, my education and my background as a historian really came useful, I must say, because look, we've had all this in Russia before. You know, you worked in the Soviet Union as a journalist. We've had all this in Russian history before, and we know how it ends. And, you know, we know that it will end because nothing is forever. But thirdly, what really helped, you know, many years ago, I was making a documentary film about Soviet dissidents. It was called They Chose Freedom. One of the people I interviewed for that film was Vladimir Bukovsky, a legendary dissident author who spent many, many years in the Soviet Gulag. And I asked him what helped him survive in those conditions, what helped him survive in prisons and labor camps and psychiatric hospitals, which he was confined to as well. And he answered very simply, I knew that I was right. And at the time, I thought this is just a nice sounding phrase. And, you know, I put it in a film, of course, because it sounded good. But having gone through the experience myself, I know just how important that is. I knew that I was right. I knew that the real criminals are those people in the Kremlin who have started the war in Ukraine, not those of us who were in prison because we had opposed it. And once you know that you're right, the fear and the doubt just go away.
When you were in court, you had pleaded with Russians not to give up protesting and demonstrating after the death of Alexei Navalny, and you asked them to continue what you called our work with even greater strength so that Russians, you said, become a normal, free European country. And you added, I have absolutely no doubt this will happen. Where does that certainty come from?
From being a historian, because we know that at the end of the day, you know, the arc of history, as they say, may not bend as fast as we'd like, but it does bend towards liberty. And the future does not belong to archaic, belligerent, repressive, one-man authoritarian dictatorships like the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin. The future belongs to democracy. And there's absolutely no reason why the Russian people should not be able to live in a developed democratic system, just like the rest of European countries do. I mean, look, if you look at the map of Europe, say, 35, 40 years ago, you know, when you were working in Moscow, by historical standards, this is nothing. This is like yesterday morning. Well, we'll see that half of the countries on the European continent were living under various forms of authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. If we look at the map of Europe today, there are only two dictatorships left. That's Putin's Russia and Lukashenko's Belarus. So the direction is very clear. And
but democracy is
absolutely no doubt.
backsliding. Democracy, according to Freedom House, has been backsliding for 18 years. And I want to know what you think, by what path Russia gets from brutal dictatorship to free European country, and what might that journey cost?
Look, one thing we definitely know from Russian history is that fundamental political change happens suddenly and quickly, at the snap of a finger. You know, both the Tsarist regime at the beginning of the 20th century and the communist regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days. This is literally how it happened. This is how it's going to happen the next time. None of us knows exactly when, how, in what circumstances the Putin regime will fall, but it will. And we have to be ready for it. Because one of the biggest problems, in my view, with the 1990s was that people were not prepared for such a swift and sudden collapse of the Soviet regime, because it seemed to be stable and secure, and it seemed to be forever. And then suddenly it was gone. And so many mistakes were made because of that unpreparedness. And we cannot afford to repeat those mistakes the next time, because as I think everybody can see very clearly now, what happens in Russia affects everyone. And the only way to ensure long-term stability, security, and peace on the European continent, the only way Europe can ever become truly whole, free, and at peace is with a democratic Russia. And so we must all be preparing for that day after Putin to make sure we do not repeat the mistakes that were made in the 1990s, to make sure that the next time we really do get it right.
You say you must all be preparing, we must all be preparing, but to do what you did is many steps too far for the vast majority of people. It's a journey to a dark place. You knew where you were taking that journey. And not only you were taking your family with them, and those close to you, your relatives, all those who were going to suffer as a result of your incarceration. That's a price that's way too high for most people to pay, isn't it?
Absolutely, and that's true of any society. In any country, you would not find many people who would be prepared to go to prison for just speaking out, you know, about what they believe in. And that is normal, by the way. I mean, otherwise humanity would not survive. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people having to speak out and go to prison. This regime will collapse. This is a historical inevitability. And when I say that we must be ready, what I mean is that we have to have a roadmap for that day after Putin. In Russia, domestically, to my mind, this means, first and foremost, that we'll have to have a process of public reckoning, a public reflection of all the crimes that are being committed by the Putin regime. Of course, the war crimes they're committing in Ukraine, but also the many crimes they're committing against and have committed against our own people in Russia: the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the assassination of Alexei Navalny, the persecution of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners in Russia today. We have a record number of political prisoners in Russia for the modern times, more than 1,300 according to human rights groups. There will have to be accountability for this, because for evil to never return again, it has to be publicly reflected on and publicly condemned. We have seen this in many countries that sort of were overcoming this trauma of past totalitarian rule. South Africa after apartheid, Latin American states after military dictatorships, Central and Eastern Europe after communism, and so on. We never really had that process in Russia in the 90s. We will have to have it after Putin. And the international aspect of this preparedness, to me, means that the West needs to stand ready to provide critical assistance to that post-Putin Russia to make sure that that transition to democracy is successful next time, but also to swiftly reintegrate that future post-Putin democratic Russia back into the civilized world, back into Europe, back into what we call the international rules-based order. Because the only way Europe can be peaceful, stable, and secure and democratic is with a democratic Russia. It's not going to happen any other way.
And you don't see that this is very difficult to take root in a world where democracy, as I said before, is backsliding, where the rules-based order is seen to be inadequate for keeping rules or keeping order. The trend is not in that direction, is it?
History always moves, as they say, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So yes, there will be backsliding, there will be regresses, there will be things that we should be concerned about, and we should be concerned about that. But at the end of the day, the direction, again, is undeniable, and the direction is unmistakable. And the arc of history does bend towards liberty, even though it may not do so as fast as we'd all like.
Very briefly, in about 15 seconds, because we're running out of time, for you going back to Russia is a matter, I think you said, of when, not if.
Absolutely.
Under what circumstances would you go back?
Once the Putin regime is gone, we will have a mammoth task ahead of us because these people, this regime will leave our country in ruins. We'll need to rebuild the economy. We'll need to rebuild the institutions of democracy. We'll need to rebuild the international reputation of our country to make sure that Russia can return to the civilized world as a normal, democratic European country. And this is what I intend to dedicate my life and my work to. And I have no doubt that day will come.
Vladimir Kara-Murza, it's been a great pleasure having you on Gambling Zone. Thank you very much indeed.
It was great to be in your program. Thank you so much.